She returned to her childhood home, but the face behind the door wasn't familiar. Sarah's heart thumped loudly as she stepped out of her car, the weight of the suitcase in her hand oddly grounding her nerves. The neighborhood lay before her like a faded photograph, rows of familiar houses, the same cracked sidewalks, and that one towering oak tree that had stood sentinel over her childhood summers. Yet the streets felt different somehow. The air carried a strange mix of nostalgia and foreignness, like stepping into a memory that had shifted in her absence. Her footsteps were tentative as she walked up the front path of what she believed was her childhood home. The white paint on the porch columns was chipped, and the garden beds she remembered so vividly were overgrown with weeds. Sarah hesitated at the door, a swirl of emotions clouding her mind: hope, anxiety, disbelief. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her hand and knocked firmly. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a woman she did not recognize. The woman's eyes were sharp, her expression guarded, a stark contrast to the warm familiarity Sarah had anticipated. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she tried to explain, I'm Sarah. I used to live here years ago." The stranger's gaze didn't soften. Instead, suspicion flickered in her eyes as she crossed her arms. "This isn't your home anymore," she said coolly. The weight of those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The place she had carried in her heart, the place that held her most cherished memories, was no longer hers. Confusion and shock battled within her. How had so much changed? Why didn't the woman recognize her? Questions swirled relentlessly as she stood there, suitcase in hand, a stranger in the only home she'd ever known. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as Sarah grappled with a reality she wasn't prepared for, a confrontation with a past she thought she understood but was now slipping through her fingers. Sarah's childhood was woven into the very fabric of that quiet neighborhood. The house on Maple Street was more than just wood and brick. It was the epicenter of her early world. She remembered the laughter echoing through the rooms, the scent of her mother's baking wafting from the kitchen, and the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains on lazy Sunday afternoons. The front porch, where she spent countless hours reading and dreaming, felt like a sacred space carved out just for her. Those were days filled with warmth and safety, a sanctuary from the chaos that sometimes rippled beneath the surface. But not all memories were gentle. Beneath the surface of her childhood happiness lay a well of pain she rarely spoke about. Her father's temper, sudden outbursts, and nights when the house seemed to hold its breath in silence haunted her. The once joyful home was often shadowed by tension and unspoken fears. Financial struggles gnawed at her parents' relationship, and the cracks in their family life grew wider with every passing year. The day she left was abrupt, a mixture of heartbreak and necessity. A tragic event had shattered her world, leaving her no choice but to escape. Her parents' divorce had been messy, with bitter words and shattered dreams spilling into the legal battles that followed. Sarah, barely out of her teens, packed her bags with a heavy heart and left, carrying only the memories she could salvage. The house, once her refuge, became a symbol of a life she needed to outrun. Since then, Sarah's life had been a journey of rebuilding and rediscovery. She moved across states, started anew in a bustling city far from the quiet streets of her youth. She threw herself into her career, working tirelessly, climbing the ranks in a marketing firm, carving out a space where she was defined not by her past but by her own achievements. Along the way, she cultivated a small circle of friends who became her chosen family, people who accepted her fully, scars and all. Yet, despite the new life she built, a part of her always felt incomplete. The pull of home was a constant undercurrent, a whisper in the quiet moments that reminded her of who she was and where she came from. Over the years, the thought of returning grew stronger, not just to revisit old memories, but to reclaim a piece of herself that had been lost in the upheaval. The house on Maple Street represented more than nostalgia. It was a chance at closure, a step toward healing wounds that had never fully healed. But Sarah also knew that returning wasn't just about revisiting happy memories. There were unresolved family conflicts that lurked in the shadows, secrets her parents kept, stories left untold, and the lingering tension of abandonment and betrayal that complicated her decision. The ghosts of her past were not just memories. They were active forces shaping her present, testing her resolve. Her hope was fragile but fierce. She dreamed of walking through that front door again and finding a sense of belonging that had eluded her for years. To confront the past, understand it, and maybe, just maybe, rebuild what was broken. But as she stood there that day, suitcase in hand, facing a stranger behind the door, Sarah realized that reclaiming her past might be more complicated than she ever imagined. The house held its secrets tight, and she was about to uncover truths that would challenge everything she thought she knew about home. Sarah's heart pounded as the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes that flickered with a mixture of suspicion and guardedness. She was dressed casually, but her stance was firm, as if prepared to defend her territory. The woman's gaze swept over Sarah from head to toe, immediately setting the tone of their first encounter, tense and unwelcoming. "I'm sorry, can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice steady but edged with wariness. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady the flood of emotions swirling inside her. "My name is Sarah. I used to live here. This was my family home. I've been away for many years, but this is my house." She pulled out a worn photo from her bag, an old picture of herself as a child standing on the porch of the house, alongside her parents. "Look, this is me here. I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to visit." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly as she took the photo, glancing at it without much acknowledgement. "I'm Linda. I bought this house 5 years ago. It's been my home since then. You must be mistaken." Her tone was polite but firm, the skepticism plain. "Do you have any proof this was your house? Any documents? Because right now, I don't see any reason to just let someone claim a property out of nowhere." Sarah nodded, pulling out a few items from her bag, a faded deed document she'd kept from her parents' belongings, an old letter addressed to her father at this address, and a worn journal filled with memories and sketches of the neighborhood. "I know it looks strange, but these belong to my family. I want to understand what happened here. Why didn't anyone tell me if it was sold? Why wasn't I contacted?" Linda's expression hardened. "I bought it legally from whoever had the right to sell it. I'm not sure about your family situation, but this is my home now. I'm sorry if you feel lost, but I can't just hand over the house because of some memories." The air thickened with tension as Sarah tried to maintain composure, fighting the rising wave of frustration and confusion. She sensed an invisible wall between them, a boundary Linda was unwilling to breach. Sarah's mind raced. How could this be possible? Had her family really lost the house without telling her? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? She glanced past Linda into the living room. The familiar warmth of her childhood home was gone. The walls were freshly painted a color she didn't recognize. Family photos that had once lined the mantel were nowhere to be seen. The space was sterile, almost deliberately stripped of personal history. On a nearby table, a modern digital photo frame cycled through images of Linda's family, reinforcing the stranger's claim. "Did anyone around here even know I was coming?" Sarah asked softly. Linda shrugged, unwilling to meet her eyes. "Neighbors don't usually get involved in old family dramas. Besides, people move on. You should too." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she stepped outside and looked around the block. The houses looked the same, but the faces of neighbors who once smiled and waved at her childhood self now averted or hurried past without a word. She caught fleeting glances, but no one stopped to speak. The warm community she remembered seemed to have evaporated, replaced by cold indifference. A creeping doubt gnawed at her. Was she misremembering? Was it possible that the house and the neighborhood had changed so much that even her own memories felt like illusions? Or was there a deliberate effort to erase her presence, to rewrite the story of her life here? As Sarah wandered the street, the familiar sights triggered flashes of memories. The old oak tree where she played, the corner store where she'd bought candies with her allowance, the swing set in the park. But each memory now felt fragile, as if someone had tampered with the foundation of her past. That night, Sarah sat on the steps of the porch, clutching her suitcase tightly. The cold air bit at her skin, but the chill inside her heart was colder. How could a place so integral to her identity become a stranger's domain? What had happened in her absence? And more importantly, why had no one told her? Her thoughts churned with suspicion and sadness. The house that once symbolized safety and belonging had transformed into a fortress of secrets. The friendly neighborhood of her youth had turned into a maze of silence and avoidance. The welcoming door she had dreamed of walking through was now closed, guarded by a woman who seemed to know nothing of her pain or history. Sarah's confrontation with Linda was more than just a clash over property. It was a battle over memory, identity, and belonging. And as she prepared to uncover the truth, she realized that the journey ahead would challenge everything she thought she knew about home, family, and trust. Sarah stood outside the local records office, the early morning sun casting long shadows on the steps as she steeled herself for what might await inside. The building was modest, worn by years of use, but within its walls lay the paper trail she needed, the key to unraveling the mystery surrounding her childhood home. Clutching her ID and a list of questions, she entered, the cool air conditioning brushing against her skin as the door closed behind her. Inside, the clerk greeted her with a polite but neutral nod, accustomed to visitors chasing forgotten histories. Sarah explained she was researching property records and ownership documents linked to her family's former address. The clerk directed her to a row of filing cabinets and a computer terminal, and Sarah settled in, methodically pulling deed records, tax assessments, and sale histories related to her old house. What she found unsettled her deeply. The chain of ownership was tangled and confusing. Records showed her family had owned the house for decades, but around the time she left, the house had been transferred, not in a straightforward sale but through a court order following a legal dispute. The paperwork referenced her family's name but was heavily redacted in parts, and the details of the dispute were vague. Sarah's pulse quickened as she noted the dates. The court case started just months after her mother vanished. Seeking more context, Sarah moved on to visit some old neighbors. She approached cautiously, knowing the neighborhood had changed but hoping to find at least a few familiar faces. At the corner cafe, she spotted Mrs. Hayes, an elderly woman who had once watched over the street like a guardian. "Mrs. Hayes, it's me, Sarah. I grew up here, remember?" Sarah said softly. Mrs. Hayes peered closely, then her face softened. "Sarah. Yes, I remember. It's been years. Your family was well known once, though people stopped talking about them after your mother left." Sarah's brow furrowed. "Do you know what happened? Why did my mom leave? And what about the house? How did it end up in someone else's hands?" Mrs. Hayes hesitated, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. There was a lot of whispering, but no one wanted to get involved. Something about money, some scandal that split your family apart. Your father, well, he wasn't the man he appeared to be. And when your mother disappeared, folks stopped asking questions. These words ignited a painful memory. Sarah recalled the long nights filled with tension between her parents, the hushed arguments behind closed doors, and the abrupt silence that followed her mother's vanishing. She remembered how her father grew colder, how neighbors began avoiding her family's house, and the eventual isolation that forced her to leave town. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah sifted through old newspaper archives at the local library. Headlines hinted at a legal battle involving her family's name, accusations of embezzlement, a bitter custody fight, and a mysterious disappearance that the press never fully explained. Articles were carefully worded, avoiding direct accusations, but the implications were clear: something dark had happened. Interspersed with these discoveries were flashbacks to Sarah's childhood, moments of warmth with her mother, laughter in the kitchen, and the sudden, shattering night when her mother disappeared without a trace. Her father's descent into bitterness and the silence that followed left Sarah feeling abandoned and confused. The neighborhood's quiet avoidance and the cold shoulder from friends hinted at secrets buried deep. With every piece of evidence, Sarah's suspicion grew that the legal battle and the loss of her family home weren't mere coincidences but part of a larger, possibly sinister plan. The redactions in court documents suggested powerful forces had an interest in keeping the truth hidden. She felt the weight of a cover-up looming, and it threatened to consume everything she thought she knew about her past. Despite the mounting uncertainty, Sarah found herself more resolute. Each discovery was a step closer to reclaiming not just the house but her history and identity. She knew the road ahead was fraught with obstacles, But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that this was more than a legal dispute. It was a fight for justice, for truth, and for the home she never truly left behind. Sarah sat at the kitchen table of a small cafe, a pile of documents and notes spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she was desperate to solve. The morning sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows, but inside her mind, everything was racing with revelations and questions. The deeper she had dug into her family's past, the more she realized the surface she had always seen was just a thin veneer masking something far darker. Her investigation took a sharp turn when she found an old diary, hidden in a forgotten box of belongings she had retrieved from a relative's house. The diary belonged to her mother, and its pages were filled with entries that painted a picture Sarah never expected, one of fear, desperation, and betrayal. Her mother had been entangled in hidden debts, mounting pressure from unknown sources, and threats that had forced her to consider leaving everything behind. The final entries were cryptic but suggested that she suspected someone close to the family was working against her, someone she once trusted deeply. This revelation hit Sarah hard. It wasn't just about a missing person anymore. It was about a carefully orchestrated unraveling of her family's life, one that involved deception and manipulation at the highest levels. As she sifted through more documents, she uncovered legal records indicating the house had been sold suddenly and under suspicious conditions. The paperwork was hurried, with signatures that seemed forged or at least highly questionable. It appeared the sale had taken place without Sarah's consent or even her knowledge. Her heart sank as she connected the dots to Linda, the woman who now claimed ownership of her childhood home. Further digging revealed that Linda wasn't just a random buyer. She was linked to her family through past business dealings, once a trusted friend of her mother's. But the trust had fractured under murky circumstances, and rumors hinted at Linda's involvement in the financial troubles and legal battles that had devastated Sarah's family. Some whispers even suggested that Linda had played a direct role in pushing Sarah's mother out, either through betrayal or coercion. The more Sarah learned, the more the sting of betrayal deepened. How could someone who once called themselves a friend turn into a foe so completely? The realization that Linda might have been complicit in the loss of her home and the destruction of her family's legacy was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet beneath the pain, a spark of vindication began to glow. This was no longer a passive loss. It was a fight against injustice. Sarah felt her resolve harden. She wasn't going to be a victim of circumstances or silent about the theft of her family's history. Every piece of evidence she uncovered fueled a fire within her to reclaim what was taken, not just the physical house but the truth and dignity of her family name. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with confrontations and challenges, but she knew she had to see it through. With renewed determination, Sarah closed the diary and gathered her documents. The past was no longer a haunting mystery, it was a battlefront. And she was ready to fight for her home, her identity, and the justice that had eluded her for so long. Sarah stood outside the front door, clutching a thick folder of documents that detailed everything she had uncovered: the legal records, the diary entries, the testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed strange dealings. Her heart pounded, but she was no longer the hesitant woman who had first knocked, confused and vulnerable. This time, she was prepared. She had allies now, friends who believed her, lawyers who offered guidance, and a resolve steelier than ever. Linda opened the door again, her expression guarded but tinged with surprise. Sarah stepped inside, folder in hand, eyes steady. "We need to talk," she said firmly. The air between them was thick with tension. Inside the familiar walls of what used to be Sarah's home, now staged with unfamiliar furniture and decorated in a style that felt foreign, the weight of years past pressed down heavily. Sarah laid out the evidence: the forged signatures on the sale documents, the diary entries revealing her mother's fears and betrayals, the whispered rumors from the neighborhood. "You knew what was happening, Linda. You were part of it. How could you?" Linda's face flickered through a range of emotions: defensiveness, sorrow, even guilt. She finally spoke, her voice low and wavering. "Sarah, you don't know everything. I never wanted it to come to this." She told her side of the story: a tangled web of financial desperation, fear of losing everything herself, and feeling trapped between loyalty and survival. Linda admitted that she had tried to help Sarah's mother at first but was pushed away, leaving her to make impossible decisions. She claimed that when the debts grew and threats escalated, she took ownership of the house legally to protect it from being lost to creditors, though she knew it broke Sarah's family apart. Their voices rose and fell as raw emotions spilled out: anger, betrayal, pain, and regret. Sarah's initial fury began to mingle with confusion and a reluctant empathy. Linda, despite her harsh actions, was also a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The confrontation wasn't just about property or money anymore. It was about wounds deeper than the surface, a family torn apart by secrets, misunderstandings, and broken trust. Sarah realized that reclaiming her past wasn't simply about possession of the house, but about healing those wounds and reclaiming her identity on her own terms. Linda looked away, tears welling. "Maybe we both lost something in all of this," she whispered. Sarah felt a tumult of emotions: the desire for justice, the sting of betrayal, and the painful possibility of forgiveness. It was complicated, messy, and far from resolved. But as they faced each other, something shifted, an opening, however fragile, toward understanding. Sarah left the house that day with no promises or resolutions, but with a newfound clarity. The battle for her home was also a battle for her own story, one she was ready to own fully, with all its pain and complexity. This emotional reckoning marked a turning point, not just in her fight for the house, but in her journey to reclaim herself and find peace amid the chaos of her past. After weeks of tense negotiations and legal battles, Sarah finally reached a resolution that felt right, not just in terms of ownership, but for her heart and future. The court ruled that the sale of the house had indeed involved questionable circumstances, and although Linda had purchased it legally on paper, the judgment acknowledged the emotional and ethical complexities tied to Sarah's family history. Rather than dragging the fight on endlessly, Sarah and Linda came to an agreement. Sarah would regain partial ownership of the home, enough to preserve the legacy of her family, while Linda would retain certain rights, allowing her to stay temporarily as the house transitioned. The compromise wasn't perfect, but it was a bridge, one that allowed wounds to begin healing instead of widening. More importantly, it symbolized Sarah's reclaiming of her narrative and her past. She realized that the house itself, though important, was not the sum total of her identity or memories. It was a vessel holding both joy and pain, and she had the power to decide how to carry it forward. With the legal dust settling, Sarah focused on rebuilding her life with renewed clarity. She renovated part of the home, preserving old photographs and heirlooms, weaving her history into the fabric of her new beginning. But she also opened her heart to new possibilities, reconnecting with old friends who had supported her journey, enrolling in courses she'd long postponed, and even starting a small community project to help others facing displacement or loss. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside the house, the golden light casting long shadows on the familiar street. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the neighborhood buzzed quietly with everyday life. Her suitcase was gone, replaced by a tote bag filled with fresh flowers and a small notebook where she jotted ideas for her next chapter. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lifted yet grounded by the lessons learned. The home behind her wasn't just a building. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and the complexity of family ties. And Sarah, stronger now, no longer needed the walls to define her. Looking down the street toward the horizon, a small smile curved her lips. The past was a chapter closed but honored. Ahead lay new roads, unwritten stories, and the quiet strength of someone who had reclaimed not only a house but herself. With hope in her heart and a steady step forward, Sarah turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the life she had fought so hard to find.